So thank you ever so much for joining us again on the Be Bold History Network. My name is Sam. I'm a teacher in West London, and I put this network together, as some of you will know, to really support teachers in developing their own subject knowledge and also taking that practice into the classroom. And I'm absolutely delighted today to be met by Stephen Bourne, who I'm sure needs no introduction, but has, as I'm sure you're aware, written a huge amount of books on all manner of diverse histories, whether it's gay history or Black British history. And I'm sure I speak for many history teachers who are on this event, who've read or come across Black Poppies, and also Stephen's more recent book, Under Fire, which he is going to talk us through today.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you so much for the invitation to take part in this. I'm really thrilled to be here and to share some of the work that I've been doing over a very long period of time, as you say. I just two things. I don't work in education, so if I don't cover a sort of educational perspective, forgive me, but you can ask me questions afterwards about more things specific to do with teaching of Black British history in our schools, which is very close to my heart. And I'm also not, in spite of the fact that I've written books on the two world wars, I'm not a military historian either. So I'm not coming from that sort of perspective either. Neither am I an academic. I've never had any kind of feeling towards academia, because what I'm going to do this afternoon is just talk you through my own personal story, my own how I got into writing Black British histories. If some of you have listened to the BBC radio broadcast that I did in September, I will be covering some of that ground, so forgive me for the repetition. But I really need to explain, because it is important, that I'm from a certain generation that were divided educationally after taking the 11 plus. So some in our final year at primary school, we did the 11 plus, and some were encouraged to go to a grammar school and some were encouraged to go to secondary modern. I ended up in a secondary modern, but I ended up in a particularly poor secondary modern in South London. I grew up in Peckham. I'm from Peckham. Grew up in a working class family and was sent to this secondary modern school, which meant that we were not educated to go to university. So university was never an option. We didn't even do GCEs, as they were called then, GCE exams. We didn't do O-levels and A-levels. So there was no access to university. That was something, if you were interested in, you could go to that later on in life and make your own way in the world. And so I left school at the age of 16 with nothing. So I never studied history, never went to university to study anything, really, but had this interest in Black British history through my adopted Aunt Esther. So when I was at secondary modern school in the 70s, 1970s, before comprehensives kind of took over, I used to bunk off and go to see the older relatives, mainly the older women in my family who all lived in Fulham, for reasons I won't bore you with. I come from Peckham, but the older relatives were in Fulham. And Aunt Esther was part of that mix. And I used to be fascinated by the stories of these working class women, this older generation, including Aunt Esther. And Aunt Esther had been adopted into my family by my great-grandmother, who I didn't know, in 1941. My great-grandmother was a working class matriarch in their Fulham community. And Aunt Esther was born into that community in Fulham in 1912. And cut a very long story short, I became interested in Black British history, or the lives of Black Britons, through her, through just talking to her, first-hand testimony. And so roll on 20 years or so, back in the late 1980s, the early 90s, we had a thing called what I call the F word. I'm not going to swear, but we had the F word, which was funding. I don't know whether any of you are old enough to remember the glory days when we had funding. And Fulham and Hammersmith were one of those progressive thinking boroughs where my Aunt Esther lived that had funding, gave funding, the local authority gave funding to an ethnic communities oral history project. And they had already published little booklets and pamphlets about the local Irish community, the local Polish community in that London borough. And so Aunt Esther's story became the focus of my first book in 1991. So Aunt Esther's story was published in 1991 by the Ethnic Communities Oral History Project. And what the project encouraged people like me to do was to use first-hand testimony as a way of recording history, documenting history, and that's exactly what I did with that book. And that's what led me in latter years, when I wrote bigger books, if you like, on Black British history, to focus on first-hand testimony, because I wasn't coming from this academic background. I never use words ending in ology. You know, I don't want to bore people. I want to engage people and get people interested. And the best way I found to do that is through the lives, first-hand testimony of the lives of the people that I'm writing about. And one of the joys of doing the work that I've done over a long period of time is meeting and befriending some of these people. Sadly, like Aunt Esther, they've gone now, they've passed away. But there was a terrible period, 8-year period, where I could not, I had a couple of books published in the 90s, and then the work, you know, publishers would not engage with me. They would not engage with Black British histories. So there was a terrible 8-year period that I went through where publishers would say to me, Black people don't buy books. There's no market for your books. So I was stalled for quite a long time before the History Press agreed to publish. The History Press, roll on, you know, I'm jumping ahead again, the centenary of World War One, which was coming up in 2014. They were very keen for me to do a book on the Black servicemen in the First World War for the centenary. That's the book I did called Black Poppies. And I said to them, I'd love to have a go, love to do it for the centenary, for it to be published in 2014. And can I include the wider Black community in Britain at that time in history, so that I could include women and children as well as men. And I also wanted to broaden out, some of you will know who this is. This is obviously Walter Tull, who by then had been remembered after decades of being ignored and forgotten, claimed to be the first Black officer in the British Army in World War One. But as I always stress to people, one of the lessons I've learned is never to claim this Black person is the first. We don't know the history. And as it's turned out, with more research, Walter Tull can no longer be claimed to be the first Black officer, because there were a few before him, because the subject is so under-researched. And Black Poppies actually turned out to be the most difficult book that I ever wrote, because of the scarcity of information. Historians had not covered this subject hardly at all. David Olusoga's book, The World's War, came out after my book, so there was very little, if anything, to work with, other than the stories that I'd collected over time. And it was a very painful process writing Black Poppies because of that, and because the information I had conflicted. But I persevered, and I finished the book in time for it to be published for the centenary of World War One, but decided in my head that this book was the worst book I've ever written. No one will want to read it. I couldn't have been more wrong. The book took off immediately, in spite of the BBC ignoring it, the mainstream media ignoring it. Word of mouth on social media in the Black community spread, and this book just did phenomenal business through the centenary period. And I've had nothing but positive feedback, and more information being sent to me, more photographs, so that last year the History Press said, hey, you know, why don't you do a new, updated, revised version? So when I did the new revised version, although I was aware that the first edition had been used in some primary schools by some teachers and secondary schools as well, I decided to write the new version in such a way that it could be read by 9-year-olds to 90-year-olds to make it more accessible, more readable. I did that consciously, and I'm glad I did that, because now with Black Lives Matter, the interest in books like this, not just my own, but other historians of Black Britain, from teachers particularly, has been phenomenal. The last couple of months have been incredible, the interest shown, which is how I come to be here today. So the stories in the book will include the stories or does include the stories of Black sailors and soldiers. This is the image that I used on the cover of the first edition. Marcus Bailey, the sailor standing up, was from Barbados, and he served in the Merchant Navy and was at the Battle of Jutland. William Robinson Clark was from Jamaica and joined the Royal Air Force, the Royal Flying Corps as it was originally, and was a pilot in the First World War, very heroic, got into some scraps with the Germans in the air in World War I. But what came home to, I don't know whether you can see this picture very well, it's a picture of 4 young men on the front line, and if you can look carefully at the picture, you see that they're on the front line. Their uniforms are ragged and covered in mud. They look exhausted. 3 of them are white, 1 of them is black, and they're together. And one of the lessons I learned in writing Black Poppies was that not all white people were racist in the First World War. Not all Black people saw themselves as victims. And I learned a very important lesson, that although racism and racist attitudes existed at that time, the racism narrative has always dominated the story of Black people in Britain, with good reason. But when I started to uncover images of comradeship between Black and white soldiers on the front line, of first-hand testimonies of Black and white soldiers on the front line, friends, comrades together. And the example I use to illustrate this is the death of Walter Tull in 1918, when he was shot and killed on the front line in battle. And that three of his white soldiers in his battalion, because he was a senior officer, so 3 of his men tried to retrieve his body from the front line. But sadly they failed, because they're under fire, they're going under barbed wire, they're under fire from the shells and the shooting, and it was a terrible, terrible time. But so they couldn't retrieve his body, so Walter Tull's body was never found. But when I started telling these stories of comradeship to young people and older people, but young people especially, on the occasions I have been invited into schools, particularly academies, the sort of secondary age group, it really empowers young people, Black and white, because they suddenly realize they have heroes in their history. They have men and women who were friends, you know, white, Black, who were friends and were comrades. So the story isn't just about racism. Racism is part of the narrative, but it's not the whole story. And I think it's an important lesson that I learned from doing the Black Poppies book, and how I approach the subject and talk about the subject now. Another soldier that I didn't really know too much about soldier in the First World War was George Roberts, who was from Trinidad and was in the Middlesex Regiment. And then after the First World War, he stayed in England, stayed in London, made his home here, married, had 2 sons, both of whom served in the Second World War, one of whom, Cyril, was a prisoner of war, captured at Dunkirk. I mean, you never see black soldiers in films about Dunkirk, but there were some there, and that's another omission that needs to be corrected in film and television portrayals. But George became one of the original members of the British Legion, and he campaigned in the 1920s for ex-servicemen to be given better treatment by the government, and he was one of the leaders of a march over Westminster Bridge. So I found all this out after the first edition was published. So in the new edition, George's story is told in more depth than in the Second World War, which is a nice sort of bridge to my latest book, Under Fire. George was too old for active service. So what did George do? He joined the London Fire Brigade and served as a fireman through the London Blitz, through the Second World War, did great work. His portrait was painted by the war artist Norman Heppel, which has now been acquired from the Norman Heppel family by his great-granddaughter. So thank goodness the painting has survived. And so that brings me nicely to the new book, Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime, 1939 to 45, which again, like Black Poppies, tells the stories of black people on the home front, black people in the armed services. And on the home front, somebody asked me the other day, who is your history hero? And it has to be Howard Moody, Dr. Howard Moody, who was a Jamaican doctor, a GP in Peckham, and founded with George Roberts the League of Coloured Peoples in 1931. So this was one of the first black-led organisations in this country. But when the war broke out, Howard was established. He was known to the Colonial Office, he was known to the government, people high up in office, and he was absolutely incensed when his son, Charles Joe Moody, he was known as Joe, was refused a commission, or refused the opportunity to become an officer in the British Army. The whole situation with Walter Tull and others in the First World War had been completely forgotten, but Charles was turned down. So Dr. Moody, his father, fought that particular colour bar, as it was called. And the British Army and the government, the military said, well, we'll lift the ban on recruits from non-European backgrounds or non-European descent for the duration of the war. But Moody said, no, we want it for the whole of the war. So that story is covered, and many others, in the new book, Under Fire, which again includes a lot of first-hand testimony. And this comes to what I said earlier about meeting and befriending some of the amazing men and women that joined the armed services in the Second World War. And one of them was Lillian Barda, who I first met way back in 1991. She lived to be, I think she was 97 when she passed away a few years ago. But we remained in touch, and she was from Liverpool. She was the daughter of Marcus Bailey, the sailor in the photograph I showed you earlier. And she was born in Liverpool in 1918, wanted to do her bit for the Second World War, and join the WAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. So she was in the Women's Air Force from 1941, married a black British soldier, Ramsay Barda, in 1943. This is their wedding photo. And Ramsay was at the D-Day landings in 1944. But Lillian, like so many, always regretted that the contribution of Black Britons and Caribbeans and Africans to the Second World War was constantly overlooked. it took many years for the West Indian Ex-Services Association campaigning to be allowed even to march at the Cenotaph every November. Extraordinary. But Lillian was one of the many that I met and befriended and was very honoured to. I never met Ulrich Cross, but Ulrich Cross is in the new book Under Fire, and he was from Trinidad. As a young lad, he wrote in his book at school that he wanted to be a flying officer in the RAF. And again, there was a colour bar, what they called a colour bar in the Royal Air Force at the beginning of the war, which again Harold Moody helped to get lifted. So black men from the colonies were barred from joining the RAF until 1941. The bar was lifted in 1940, partly because of the decimation of the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain of 1940. But the first recruits didn't start to come to this country, and Ulrich was one of the first from the Caribbean, that is, in Africa. Peter Thomas was the first Nigerian to join the RAF in March 1941. Ulrich joined also in 1941. And when Under Fire was covered in this book, Britain at War has been published for some years now. But to my knowledge, and in my experience, this is the first time a British war magazine, and there are many, has put a black serviceman on the cover. So it's quite a breakthrough. And this was in the October issue, the last October, just gone issue. And Ulrich was one of the most highly decorated black servicemen in the Second World War. He received the DFC and the DSC from the King George VI at Buckingham Palace. And this is a photograph of him at Buckingham Palace after he had received these honours in 1945 at the end of the war. And he survived where so many didn't. One of the kind of sad stories in Under Fire is the fact that I have to cover those that, so I'm just trying to get the book, those that lost their lives. And when I found this wonderful picture of, wow, sorry, time for glasses, of Sergeant Dickinson from Canada and Sergeant Leslie Gilks from Trinidad. If you can see in the book, they're there. It's a lovely picture of, again, friendship and comradeship. People had to get on in the war. And tragically, Sergeant Gilk was killed in action shortly after this photograph was taken. He was shot down in his plane over Germany. And there are many, many other stories in the book, which I'm sure you will find fascinating. Princess Ademola from Nigeria, who was a nurse. This is before the NHS. She actually came to Britain in 1938 and trained as a nurse at Guy's Hospital. There's Leary Constantine, cricketer from Trinidad, who became a welfare officer during the war, with Una Marson, a Jamaican feminist, who had hosted and produced her own BBC radio series called In the West Indies, and that's a photograph from that. So there are many, many, many people, and these, to get back to education and schools, I know there is a big drive on at the moment to get Black British history taught in schools, but it is a huge, massive subject. And I assume most of you calling in this afternoon are teachers and probably teach history. I do feel for you, because this is a massive subject. It's not, and how you teach it is going to be difficult because of the wealth of information. But my advice would be, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to talk about racism, but don't be afraid to talk about friendship as well. Using, if you like, some of the examples that I've given, because it is very, as I say, empowering. I use that word for young people from all backgrounds to hear that, as I say, not all white people were racist, not all black people saw themselves as victims. And that is part of the mix, that is part of the story as well. I'll end there because I've covered quite a lot of ground. I mean, I wish I could say more, but I've given you hopefully an insight into the kind of work that I've been pursuing all these years, and hopefully will continue to pursue. But it does thrill me that the education world, if you like, is beginning to catch up. Better late than never, but it's not your fault. I mean, I did go to the Department of Education 3 years ago with Black Poppies and asked them if there's anything they could do to help me raise the profile of the Black Poppies book, and it was like talking to a brick wall. I'll end there and take questions, but do feel free to ask anything.
What impact do you think the lack of these stories, the omission really of Black history over a number of years has had both on young people, but also people who have gone through the education system, 10 years ago, like I was 20 years ago, really, if I'm honest, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? What impact do you think that has had on our society at large?
Had an enormous impact, a huge impact. I cannot stress it enough. And why it's so close to my heart, and thank you for asking that question, because I don't think that question is considered enough. I live in South London. I still live in the area that I grew up in. So I work as a voluntary independent advisor to the local police and have done for 20 years. That came about as a consequence of the Macpherson report into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, a recommendation that every London borough, 32 boroughs, has to have an independent advisory group made up of people in the community that work with their senior police officers, including the borough commander. And I'm the longest serving in my borough. I may be the longest serving in London, I don't know. But that's not what it's about. What I've witnessed in my community is gang crime, knife crime amongst youths, particularly Black youths. And I kind of know in my heart that some of them may have been deterred from that kind of lifestyle if they had had a better self-image. And you get a better self-image from all kinds of different factors. But one very important one would be, in my opinion, teaching the things that I've been talking about this afternoon. That has been completely missing. I was invited into a local academy a couple of years ago to talk about Black Poppies, and the classroom was predominantly African Caribbean, young African Caribbean students. I would imagine their ages were about 13, 14, maybe 15. And I started by saying, you learn about Dr. Martin Luther King, you learn about Rosa Parks, you learn about African Americans, but you never learn about Black Britons from history. And what happened next was this, they went like that, screaming, and not screaming, but yelling and raising their hands and stamping their feet. And the teacher was like shocked, and I was shocked because I'd never had that reaction. They know, and this is before Black Lives Matter, they knew something was integral to their understanding of their history was missing in their schools. And it's not the teacher's fault if the teachers are not encouraged to think about this and to take the easy option, which is to teach about Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, who are very important, iconic Black figures, but it's always about African Americans. And we've got to stop doing that to young people. I would like to see Dr. Martin Luther King taught in schools alongside Dr. Howard Moody, because Dr. Howard Moody was once described by a professor as Britain's Martin Luther King. What a wonderful way of bringing Dr. Howard Moody into the classrooms by comparing the two. Yes, it's very, very important to self-image, the self-image of young people and the confidence. We all need heroes from history. We all need them.
And you've spoken a bit about this already, but I know we were talking the other day about a particular school that you went into where they'd read your books, and or a particular school you're about to go into where they've kind of read your books and are very excited about seeing you. So I guess kind of linked to that, what's over the years of going into schools and talking to students about this, what impacts have you seen then on kind of changing that, as it were?
The first time it happened was a particular teacher up in an academy in North London. He was teaching, he told me that he was teaching World War One. World War One is on the school curriculum. Okay, I didn't know that, but it is. And he was getting tired of trying to teach World War One during the centenary period to a classroom which was predominantly African Caribbean students. And they were bored out of their skull because all he could teach them was about white servicemen. So he Googled black soldiers in World War One, and I kept coming up, and Black Poppies kept coming up. So he tentatively sent me an email and said, he didn't think I would do it, but he said, would you come into the school? And I said, yeah, I'd love to, just out of curiosity. And I went up to this academy in North London, I think it was in Hackney or Haringey, and it was brilliant. And I realized, but it's very rare that's happened up until Black Lives Matter. It was down to the initiative of the individual teacher, which is why I went to the Department of Education and tried to have this conversation with them and say to them, look, there are history teachers up and down this country that need to know my book, Black Poppies Exist. I don't care what they do with it. They can ignore it for all I care. But they need to be given the choice to ignore it or buy it and use it in their classroom. So we already have World War One in the school curriculum. So now I would encourage teachers that teach World War One to have a look at Black Poppies and David Olusoga's book, The World's War. I'm Not Selfish, and any other books that are related to the subject, and see what they can do to highlight that, even if they don't have any black kids in their class. Doesn't matter. It's history for everyone.
Yeah, it's the authenticity that I think we keep on coming back to, isn't it? And actually, this enhances history. It makes it more true to what it actually history actually was. So in the meantime, we've had lots of questions coming on the chat, which is fantastic. Keep them coming on, please, or coming through, please. The first question, where would you recommend that we look for primary sources and stories to help us create lessons? I guess obviously your book is one place to go, but where else might we go to find kind of original transcripts or letters or diaries or things like that, I guess?
Well, I hate to say it because it is my book. I mean, because I do include bibliographies and detailed notes so that if people want to pursue other sources that are not written by me, as I say, I don't like to think I'm a selfish person. I want to share other people's perspective as well, because mine is just my perspective, but it's not the only one. But I like to think Black Poppies is as much a resource book as a book to learn from, that there are resources there. It's a difficult one to answer off the top of my head, but we are getting better at it. So if you Google the subject, there's more information around. But in terms of the school curriculum, I don't know how that operates. I don't know how that works. But hopefully more educational publishers. I have recently written for an education publisher. I won't announce who it is, or because I don't know whether I'm allowed to yet, but it's going to, on Dr. Howard Moody, I've done a little book for Key Stage 2, 9 to 11-year-olds, which is going to go online, I believe, in January. But I'll come back to you, Sam, about that, and you can spread the word when it goes live. So that has started to happen for me, and if it's happening for me, hopefully it's happening for others. I know that David Olusoga has written, because he's been asked to, which has now been published, a children's primary school version of his big weighty book, Black and British, which is brilliant. But there's also, I would suggest, getting away from the two world wars, Patrick Vernon and oh goodness, I know I go blank. the 100 Great Black Britons book, which has just been published as well, and that's very accessible because it's like A to Z of the 100, Angelina Osborne, sorry, and Patrick Vernon's 100 Great Black Britons, which they've been working on for many years. It's a fabulous book and very accessible, particularly to teenagers, students of that age group.
Absolutely, thanks for that. And people have been writing in the chat as we're talking, actually, that if any other teachers are interested, that they found the archive offices are very useful for that kind of thing. And also National Archives, which obviously is a good place always to go.
I mean, absolutely. The War Museum, the National Archives, I've used all those archives, absolutely. The British Library for more obscure things. There are resources out there.
So a number of other questions coming in as we're talking. Sean has asked, would you mind just speaking a little bit more about Marcus Bailey and Lillian Barda? It sounds like she's wanting to use them, or that family connection, in her lessons. And she had a couple of sort of specific questions. Did Marcus settle in Liverpool and marry following the war? And would he, or might he have been affected by the 1919 Liverpool race riots?
No, they didn't live in Liverpool. Marcus served in the First World War until the end of the war and carried on. But the mother sadly died. Lillian's mother died. And so he moved the children. There were 3 children. Lillian had 2 older brothers. And they moved, I think it was to Hull. The mother actually died tragically in a flood, the famous Fleetwood flood of, I can't remember what year, it was when the children were very small. But sadly, Marcus died. Marcus died in 1927, so Lillian was only 9 when she'd lost both her parents and her older brothers. And, well, she had her older brothers, but they were split up. They were sent to one orphanage and she was sent to another. So the children actually grew up in orphanages, and she was separated from her 2 brothers. She tried to keep in touch with them and managed to with great difficulty from then on. But sadly, Jim, her brother Jim, who was Marcus's son, obviously, served in the Navy, the Merchant Navy in the Second World War, but was killed in action in 1941. The year that Lillian joined the WATS, Jim was killed when his ship was torpedoed. And I did actually find his name on the famous Tower Hill Memorial. So if Sean is interested in the family connection, it's all in the book, but there's more to be found. There's more about Lillian and her family on the internet. But if the school that the teacher wants to do this is close to Tower of London, and when lockdown lifts, it's great to take young people to the memorials, the Tower Hill Memorial. It took me ages to find his name because there's hundreds and hundreds of names on the Tower Hill Memorial, but James Bailey is there, the son of Marcus Bailey. Yeah.
It's wonderful to have that connection, isn't it? So there's been another question from Carleen Jones. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I did spend some time living in Wales, so you would think I'd be able to. But she asks really about how we term Black history in itself. And I guess really her question is that the right term to be using? Does that mean perhaps that we then accidentally, I suppose, marginalize that history and almost make it another, perhaps maybe we should be terming it as history, I guess is what she's saying. I don't know if you had anything.
In an ideal world, I would agree, but we don't live in an ideal world, and we never have. We have separated out black and white, and we've ignored the Black history. So for myself, we've still got a long way to go to integrate the two and live in an ideal world. There's still a lot of gaps, unfortunately. There's still a lot of stories to be uncovered, and which is why I support Black History Month. Black History Month isn't for everyone, but for me, for 23 years, I've been giving Black History Month talks. It's a wonderful showcase, and people forget that in my experience, it tends to be the more educated people that look down their nose at Black History Month. There's a bit of snobbery that goes on, I'm afraid. But the working class people in the Black community particularly look to October to go to free events, accessible events in their communities. And I've done Black History Month events at the National Portrait Gallery, the Imperial War Museum, pensioners' centres, community centres. You know, I'm not grand. I don't consider myself grand. So I'll go where I'm asked. Libraries, particularly public libraries, are tremendous for getting the ordinary folk in. Do you understand? People don't see it in the way that I do. And I've met many wonderful people that have come to my talks and given me very positive feedback, because authors, historians, you know, we need to know we're doing the right thing and doing it in the right way. And that personal feedback, but I only get that in October. I remember some years back when I gave a talk, another talk, Black History Month talk for the War Museum, I begged them, I said, can I come and do this in April? You know, just for a change. And they wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't do it. Now they don't do Black History Month at all. So I was lucky to get October, because the Imperial War Museum, sad to say, has gone backwards. And I say that from my own personal experience, but there are plenty of other venues and organisations that do support it, thank goodness. Yeah.
Sian, by the way, has said thank you for sharing that, and also she has a family member herself who's also on the Tower Hill Memorial.
I did see it. I read it. That's why I put the glasses on.
Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you, Sian.
I just had one more question, and I know obviously you spoke already really about your history hero, but if you were going to pick one of the servicemen particularly who you've written either which one do you find the most interesting or the most engaging story, and why?
Oh goodness. I would say Lillian Barda, because she reminded me so much of my Aunt Esther. They were the same generation. They were both mixed race. They both had Black Caribbean fathers and white mothers, English mothers. And they both grew up in Britain at the same time, although had very different experiences, because although Aunt Esther lost her mother when she was young, her Black father raised her as a single dad in this Fulham community. And when I met Lillian, she struck me as being they were very feisty. They were very proud to be British born and to be British. They were very proud of their Caribbean heritage, and they both did service in the Second World War. So Lillian served in the WAFs. My Aunt Esther was a hospital cleaner. She cleaned hospital wards in Brompton Hospital and was a fire watcher. She volunteered as a fire watcher on the roof of Brompton Hospital, looking for incendiary bombs that the Germans would drop in. A very frightening, risk-taking thing. So, but if it has to be a serviceman or woman, it would have to be Lillian, because she, against the odds, did something really special and very important, but knew why she was doing it. And when Lillian was challenged, I think the only time she ever appeared on television was in a discussion program about this, about why did Black servicemen and women serve in the Second World War, and young Black people, this was about 25 years ago, challenged her and said, why did you support the British when the British had an empire and colonized, which is a very valid question. She looked at this young Black guy in the audience and said, because we would have ended up in the ovens. And what she meant was, if we'd allowed Hitler to overrun Britain, Black people would have ended up in the ovens, the same as Black people in Germany.
Thanks for watching this video from the Be Bold History Network. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter @BeBoldHistory, and if you are talking about us, use the hashtag BeBoldHistory. Thanks for watching.